With us here on this on this panel on the Constitution, I believe we were supposed to have Andy Miles. I don't believe he's here. No. Check if he's here. But Andy was instrumental on developing the Scotland Act back in the late 1990s, and he had some ideas for a constitutional convention, and so we would have welcomed his. Maybe is he here? Anyway. But in any case, we have Sara Salyers, we have Ian, who's remaining with us, won't be doing a formal presentation, but is here to chip in. And also during the Q&A, if you had some questions for him about infrastructure that you wanted to ask before, you're of course more than welcome. So Sarah's going to begin talking about the Scottish Constitution that is already in existence, even though it's been hidden and for many years, and also some of the very important elements of this written constitution that is encased in the claim of right, and then what I'm going to, once she's talking about that and talked about the very beautiful elements of this, despite the sectarian rhetoric that we see both in the claim of right and in the Treaty of Union and most documents from that
the Bill
period.
of Rights.
It still includes many very positive elements. So she'll be speaking about that. Then I'm going to speak about given that the U.S. Constitution is the one that I'm most familiar with, having studied it for many decades. I want to talk about the way in which the U.S. Constitution was developed. And also who it was designed, not only how it was developed, but who it was designed for. And I'll give you a spoiler alert. It wasn't the mass of people that it was written for. And so I want to talk about that and just very broad strokes about how the U.S. Constitution has developed since then. And then I'm going to give I'm going to put in what essential elements must be included in a Scottish written constitution to avoid, so we're not anywhere near the Westminster unwritten constitution has developed that serves its primary purpose of maintaining the caste structure that it's existed in the UK, for many centuries. So. Take it away, Sarah.
Okay. Forgive me, I'm really tired today, so I'm referring to notes. So if I have to stop and check, just bear with me. Okay, so I think there's not really any need to talk about why we have to have a constitution, both written and codified. And as you know by now, a codified constitution means that all the provisions of a constitution are gathered in one place. They're expressly written down. So you can see it in black and white, any aspect. And as Elliot explained, that covers a very large spectrum of provisions that need to be in place. But there's also always a kind of core constitution. And in every case, that represents a contract between the people and their government. So let's imagine we've got people currently working away on the Scottish Constitution. What a great idea. Let's design the best possible constitution. Let's take the best elements from the countries that have developed constitutions over the years. We can imagine anything we like. How amazing that we could put together a brand new, isn't that inspiring? Mm-hmm. No. Let's not. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's not ignore what we have heard Professor Alf Baird explain so heartbreakingly eloquently about what colonization does to the identity of a people, how it erases their history, their language, their culture, and political and constitutional identity. You don't know who you are. You don't know how you develop the political, how you develop the political and social structures that you had in the past, because they've all been erased. Scotland actually, by the end of the 1700s, or 1600s rather, was the most democratic nation in Europe. But that's not what the history books will tell you. That's not what the scholars and the experts will tell you. And they'll laugh at you at the idea that Scotland was anything but politically primitive. A bunch of warring factions where the strongest and the most powerful prevailed. Well, I'm here to tell you that that was a lie, and it still is. It was never that way in Scotland. Go and look at our histories, go and look at the legal and political histories that are available. There's a very peculiar absence. There's no Gaeltacht. There's no mention of the influence of the Celtic system on Scottish political, social, and constitutional development. Not a dicky bird. You would think that we came into existence when feudalism entered Scotland in the 12th century, and then combined with Roman canon law. Political system of thought and the compact between the people and the government was very much in place right up until the late 1700s, when it was decided to civilize the Highlands. That was the name of the program. They had to put over 300 former English veterans in place across the Highlands to stamp out the Scottish Brehon courts and the Scottish law. That was just one of the things they did. So let's come back to what we're here to talk about, the Scottish Constitution. The Scottish Constitution developed out of that social political influence. The Gaeltacht was across more than 90% of Scotland. I mean, right up to the 1900s. And out of that, we got two principles. The sovereignty of the Scottish people, which you see in the Declaration of the Clergy and the Declaration of Arbroath. It's then reenacted in statutes from that time all the way up to the Claim of Right in 1689. And the second provision, which was the primacy of the common good. We have been colonized. We have a constitution. The uncodified English constitution is extracted out of their historical documents. Nobody has done that for Scotland. Nobody's even looked at our public records, our parliamentary records, to see what our constitution says. But if the record has been damaged and partially lost, something that happened in 1689 was that in order to depose a government, please bear in mind, people will say, well, it's a king. They wanted to get rid of a king. In Scotland, the king had not abdicated. They had to depose him. If they'd had to depose the monarch in England, at that point, before Parliament was sovereign, they'd have had to depose themselves too. Scotland had a constitutional provision called the Convention of the Estates. So we had a Parliament that developed from the King's Council, as it did in all European countries. We had something Scottish, developed out of the Guardians of the Realm, became the Greater Council of Scotland, and then the Convention of the Estates, which means the Assembly of the Peoples. That had been, you've no idea how many times that was called, but it wasn't a sitting body. It was called as needed. It's a constitutional provision in Scotland. That had the power to sack a government under certain conditions. Should that government violate the compact, which in the Claim of Right is described as the fundamental constitution of Scotland, the only statutory document that talks about a fundamental constitution in the history of the United Kingdom. And in the 1600s, fundamental wasn't used the way we used it. Oh, that's a fundamental part of life. No, it meant the foundation. The foundation of Scotland is its constitution, says the Claim of Right. What does it say? It says that there are legitimate ends for government. That means that there are things a government can do that make it illegitimate. The legitimate ends of government is not to do what this king with his parliament has done. And then it spells them out. It spells out two things. All the things which are protected come under the common good, the things we're entitled to. And they reflect how Scots feel. It's amazing. Privilege is a dirty word in this constitution. It should be a dirty word today. Privilege means private law. Private law. You've no idea how many laws Scotland passed to ensure that everybody, from the king to the cooper, had the same access to justice and was subject to exactly the same justice. Exactly the same. William the Orange couldn't believe it after he got them to carry out the Glencoe massacre, that Scotland was getting ready to put him on trial, a king. But they were getting ready to summon him to appear in court. That's why he offered them Darien, but that's another story. Everybody under our constitution, everybody, Boris Johnson, Her Majesty the Queen, Rishi Sunak, whoever you like, Dross, they're all subject, and by the way, all our MSPs. Subject to exactly the same law. And fortunately for us, the provisions, the things they cannot violate, are set out in the Claim of Right. Are those who are looking to write a new constitution going to put in the sovereignty of the Scottish people the way it is in a constitution that took over 1,000 years to develop? 1,000 years. Are they going to respect the identity of the Scottish nation for whom they are writing this constitution? Are they going to honour the nature, the character, the soul of a people who said, we're all Jack Tamson's bairns, or whose bard wrote, a man's a man for all that? Is that going to be in the constitution? Are they going to be happy, those on high, who get together in their little groups to write a constitution, to ensure that a constitutional provision, which includes this ombudsman, this tribunal, which represents the people who lend their power to government, only lend it. You can't transfer popular sovereignty to a parliament or it becomes parliamentary sovereignty, just like Westminster's. And that's nothing but an elected dictatorship. If all you get to do is vote, that's not democracy.
Yeah.
So are they looking at Scotland's ancient, powerful and modern constitutional provisions and making sure they're there? You know what? I don't think so. I welcome, embrace and celebrate all new Scots with all my heart, but I do not blame new Scots for feeling that there's no real importance about, we're going to have a new Scotland. Let's not bother with the past. We will not heal from 300 years of vicious, tyrannical oppression, of blood and pain and suffering and famine and desperation and being driven out of our land by saying, let's have a new Scotland. It's not going to do anything for us. Healing comes from being given back what's ours. And that's a scary thing. And that's a very scary thing for those who've got used to the greasy pole of the Norman feudal system that is now falling apart and running rampant across the political scene. What? Be answerable to the people. Be answerable to the unwashed masses. Oh my God. Aye, you will be. And here's why. Here's the last piece of this puzzle. We have suffered so much and so hard and so long. And there's not an old Scot that doesn't have a story. My grandmother, not allowed to learn Gaelic. My grandmother on my father's side, miner's daughter. Hear their stories. Nobody, our relatives in Australia, our relatives in Canada, none of us, none of the old Scots, who are no more Scots than the new Scots, but we're the old Scots, don't have this story. And a colonized nation has problems that are almost like the problems of an individual who's gone through serious abuse. There's drug dependency, alcoholism, high suicide rates, hopelessness. It's the picture of Native Americans, Aboriginals in Australia, and Scots and Irish before the independence. That is this picture of a colonized nation. If you look at South Africa, what happened after independence, what happened after they got rid of that system? The brilliance of Nelson Mandela was to have peace and reconciliation, heal. So we're angry now. We can't stay angry once we're free. We need to heal. The Constitution of Scotland is a way of healing because it sets out a journey that we made, which expresses the compact between people and power and which was taken from us. It'll do two things. One, it is uniting people across Scotland. It's moving so fast I can't keep up with it. It's taking my breath because we've known and we've missed it and we wanted it. It gives us a route. You know, what Elliot was talking about, when we have independence and through the referendum. So I have a wee thing I was going to say. I'm sorry I'm a wee bit late, but I'm going to read this anyway. So here's my message to all those who are talking about, with all the best will in the world, who have no vested interest in an ancient Scottish constitution because they're New Scots, or they're identifying with New Scots. I understand that. To all of those going, what we need to persuade everybody to vote this way in the referendum, bring over the soft vote, convince people. I have, as I said before, I have a question for you. Do you also believe in a flat earth? Because the scientific evidence is in. Where is this? I told you I'd have to check my notes. So this is my message. Any route to independence that depends on the honour of the old boys or the new boys in the British establishment, an establishment that has shown itself repeatedly and consistently to be willing to act in the most dishonourable and despicable ways in its own interest, that depends on fairness from a state that has shown and continues to show utter contempt for the principles of justice, that depends on adherence to law or binding agreement of what has become a rogue state, presently in violation of both international and domestic law, and I give you the EU Withdrawal Bill and the Northern Ireland Protocol. In short, any route to independence that depends on, in any way whatever, on the honour, fair dealing and dispassionate observance of law by a state whose right to make, break, alter or ignore any law or any treaty whatsoever in its own interests is enshrined and whose rights is enshrined in the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty is a dead end. The bottom line is simple. They will not let Scotland go. There are no circumstances in which Scotland can negotiate with the British state for independence and actually achieve it. And we have to stop the wishful self-delusion that such a route was ever on the cards. So we have to leave. And the way that we leave is to reinstate, through a mass civil movement, international recognition of the fact that we have an international treaty with a binding condition. The binding condition is that we have a constitution, and that constitution is supposed to be in place in Scotland. We can use that constitution to get the independence that I'm afraid Elliot's route through a referendum it's a complete nonsense to imagine it will achieve it. We can achieve it that way. We can achieve it with the whole of Scotland together and behind it, and we will get that. We will get that. And when we do, we start. We've already got the basis. We can start working on it now, turning what the provisions are in the Claim of Right into modern language so that everybody knows what they are. We've got the start, and we'll never let go of popular sovereignty that way. We get real political reform that way. We get the people upholding the common good that is so desperately needed that way, and we get independence that way. And that is both our route to freedom, our route to political change, and our route to healing from 300 years of abuse.
Wow, how the hell do you follow that? Well, I'll take a different approach. This will have a slightly different tone, but maybe at the end I'll get a little clap. Anyway, so I wanted to approach it a little differently, and in the sense of wanting to talk about my experience, of course, as an American with the U.S. Constitution and the way in which it was developed back in 1789, the reasons it was, and how the constitutional development process for an independent Scotland needs to be as far away from that process as is humanly possible. Just a little bit about the prior to the Constitution. Now we, of course, had the beginnings of the reasons for the War of Independence in the United States are fairly well known. We tend to think about the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and these other things that accumulated up until the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775, followed by the Declaration of Independence in 1776, of course, where we celebrate which we celebrate on July 4th. And then after that, there was the Continental Congress, which met up until 1789, and was governed under the Articles of Confederation. And this was this took quite a while. It took several years. I think it was 1777 through 1779, something like that, where they were developing the Articles of Confederation because they wanted a deliberately weak central government, and so they came up with the Continental Congress, which was very unwieldy. It had delegates meeting, and they could pass laws, but you had to have 7 of the 13 votes to pass a law. It couldn't be applied. There was no effective tax collection, and the state governments were in complete disarray. Many had borrowed to finance the Revolutionary War, etc. And then. So there was no judiciary. There was a president of the Congress, but it didn't have any executive power in the modern sense. So it was very ineffectual. And changing the Articles of Confederation required unanimity among the states in order to change it, similar to the way the European Union treaties operated. There has to be unanimity. These institutions were largely composed of rich landowners, often most slave owners, and so they had obviously an interest in in maintaining that status. But then between August of 1786 and February of 1787. These rich landowners got spooked in what was called Shays' Rebellion. And it was a popular uprising in Massachusetts, again, in 1786 and 1787, lasting about 6 months, where because of the dire economic conditions, the corruption of the governments, the state governments in this case, and this led to a peasant farmers uprising where they, took guns and pitchforks and the like. And I believe in Springfield, Massachusetts, basically shut down the government because the courts were, they were collecting taxes, they were repossessing land, from the largely poor farmers, and they didn't like it, and the aristocrats were spooked because wait, we just fought a revolutionary war over the payment of taxes, and so if we're getting attacked because we are because opposition to a collection of taxes there, that could lead to revolution. So they said, whoa, we got to keep a lid on this. We can't have these popular uprisings that would threaten our economic interests. So in 1787, it was pretty obvious that a lot of these deficiencies in the Articles of Confederation were very present. And so there was a meeting in the Continental Congress, and they decided, okay, it needs to be changed. How do we do it? Okay, they said, well, we'll form a commission, and they can go away and they can, propose recommendations for the changing of the Articles of Confederation. But it had to be unanimous. So they can go off and make make some proposals, come back to the Continental Congress, they'll consider it, and maybe if they're good ideas, that they'll be unanimously accepted by the Continental Congress. Went off to Philadelphia, 1787, shut the shutters. Made sure sworn to secrecy. They can't say anything to the press, and they didn't want reporters hanging around outside the thing to see, oh wow, what are they talking about? And the votes were secret. They could change the votes. But anyway, they went through several months of this in the summer of 1787. Almost all of them were landowners, rich merchants, slave owners, etc., who wanted to maintain their status, and they wanted to keep a lid on popular uprisings, and that was their central focus. That anything that could threaten their economic interests. So they deliberated, and and what's interesting is that you have the Federalist Papers that were written mostly in 1789. There were a series of eloquent articles by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, explaining all in wonderful, eloquent language about the advantages of this or that. But their notes were taken also of the deliberations as well, but they were kept secret, and they were in the notes from not the Federalist Papers, these eloquent arguments, but the notes of themselves. They were kept for many decades. I think that it wasn't until the 1840s or 50s that the notes for especially Hamilton, who took the most extensive notes. The other ones did take some notes, but Madison's were the most extensive. And you kind of see why they were hidden, because one of the most prominent features is they talk a lot about minority rights. And when you think of minority rights these days, oh yeah, of course, Hispanics or blacks or other, minorities, their rights need to be protected. That's not the minority they had in mind. They had the minority of the opulent, the rich, that their rights had to be protected, and their property rights had to be protected. Now, property rights is somewhat of a misleading idea. You think you have for example, I have this pen. Okay, all right, it's my property. Okay, it's my pen. Does this pen have any rights? No, it's a pen.
It writes.
Well, okay. Why didn't I think of that? You ruined my analogy. Anyway, but the idea that property has rights is absolutely absurd. But it's more the rights of people to own property and to own more and more property. And that was the whole, and this served as the basis of the American expansion throughout the West, and the imperial colonialism, the Monroe Doctrine, expansionism, manifest destiny, all of that. The Constitution was designed to facilitate that and to facilitate the further expansion of the of the states. So it was designed to protect the interest of the opulent minority. And the way it did this, in part, was the Senate was the most powerful organ in the, the senators. There were 2 per state. They were chosen by the state legislatures, and they didn't become popularly elected until the early 20th century, but they were invariably landowners, and so they would, the Senate, and so the treaties had to be ratified by the Senate. All of the appointments had to be, confirmed by the Senate. The president had some powers, but nothing, but the list of the congressional powers were much longer. And so again, it was the Senate was the central organ of it at that time, and still is obviously a very powerful branch of the U.S. government. The president he veto, commander in chief, and a few other ones. And appoint judges that had to be confirmed by the Senate, but it was largely a figurehead. The American presidency didn't really gain much more power until, at least domestically, until the New Deal of the 1930s. And you also had the House of Representatives, which was the most democratic of the institutions. But even now, in the House of Representatives, it was apportioned among the population, but they had this problem. Lots of slaves. How do we get around this? So if we give the southern states, which had more slaves, or the states with the slave populations, if we count these as population, then they're going to have a much bigger population. So what do we do? I know. Let's count each slave as 3/5 of a person.
Human.
That'll work. Yeah, okay. But they completely excluded Indians. I mean, Indians were not even on the map, and so except those who had been assimilated in some way. So it's a popularly elected. What does that mean? Now the states themselves had the right to select had the right to set up the elections and their method of voting. And some were, and the franchise was specified in the state constitutions. I did a study on this with Paul McCartney a few years back, and I looked through the original state constitutions that were adopted that were basically replacements of the colonial charters that the British had imposed, very similar to the Scotland Act, each of the state constitutions specified who could vote and who was an elector, and invariably it was white landowning Christian males. You had to be Christian. Some of them you had to believe in the Trinity, or you had, and so they had these were the qualifications. And so usually it was only I think maximum 6% of the vote in any of people had the vote in any particular state. They were electing the House, the state legislatures. There were, you had to have a certain value. You had a certain amount of wealth. And all of these, and so it was very narrow. So the president was, of course, elected by the Electoral College, which at the time was, well, anyway, we won't go into that. But so the only remotely democratic institution in the United States was the House of Representatives, and even that was only elected by 6%, maybe maximum 6% of the population. So nowadays, I mean, it has evolved. It has, the franchise has been expanded after the Civil War. Blacks were given the right to vote. The 1920, the women were given the right to vote, and tacking on these amendments to the Constitution. So I don't believe in golden eras of democracy, especially in the United States, but the 1960s is probably as close as you get, when you had these successful civil movements, the civil rights movement, and the change of at least the change in the law that followed the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. So, it has become more democratic, but then there was a very important document, I think it was 1971, called the Powell Memo. And this was written by Lewis Powell, who later became a Supreme Court justice. And and was but at the time, I believe was he was head of the Chamber of Commerce or some corrupt corporate lobbyist, whatever. And so he wrote this memo, and it was basically, I mean, you could definitely read it sometime. It's really illuminating because you had the 60s, you had the civil rights movement, you had the anti-war movement, you had all these mass civil rights movement, going on. It was just way too much democracy. I mean, we can't have that, and we have to defend capitalism, we have to fight back, we have to beat back these democratic waves that are coming up, and they've done really well at it. I mean, it's pretty scary, but how successful they've been in extending almost complete corporate control over the United States, the rolling back of the elections, of the electoral laws, and also not coincidentally, I think the Powell memo was 71, and then in 1973 was the formation of a institution called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. I didn't even know about this thing until like 10 years ago. I'd never heard of it, and I'd been studying American politics since Reagan, and but it's this massive lobbying institution where you have virtually all, you can go to ALEC Exposed, ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council Exposed, and it has all of the list of the corporations that are members of ALEC, page after page after page, all of the big, corporate, big corporations. And on the other hand, you have almost all Republican state legislatures that are members of ALEC. And you have all of these different industries, the prison industrial complex, the weapons manufacturers, all of these different, the oil industry, the pharmaceutical industry, all of these things have absolute chokeholds on particularly the state government and also by extension the federal government. And they're rolling back union rights even more. They've rolled back all these insane gun restrictions. The stand your ground laws, concealed carry, all that come through ALEC. The abortion decision that just came down, that ALEC had a big part in that, and because a lot of the institutions that they have with them, the Federalist Society, which has been basically the mill for appointing conservative judges to the Supreme Court, but I could go on, but it's complete corporate corruption, and I don't know how America is going to get out of it. I just don't know. And that was one of the primary things that motivated me when I began working for the Scottish Independent, because it's like, I remember in 2011, wow, it's going to be a referendum in Scotland. Cool. Wow, they could get they could get a new written constitution, and they can get rid of all the corporate corruption that the America has. And then the more I learned about the British system, it's like, oh wow, that's really rotten as well. and I don't know, there's something, but it's weird because the American corruption is kind of like the nouveau riche corruption, but the British corruption, ghastly and feudal, and just the droit de seigneur and all this stuff. That's it just makes your stomach churn. As I know you, given the. And so, I mean, and that was, and also, campaign finance. I taught, and that's just one part of it. But the way that the elections are conducted, the lack of democracy. So in this, and the Constitution that I've developed is on the SSRG website. And we will be adding more features to that to help, so that you all as well can contribute to it, suggest ideas, so that we can help refine it over time. But what I also wanted to, and when I wrote this, I had no idea about all of these things that Sara has revealed through her meticulous research. But I did have an instinct. I grew up, my dad was a Scot, so, I know what they're like. I've always known what they're like, because my dad's a Scot. And while he had an anglicized accent, he was so, his heart, his soul was Scottish, and so that's always, and the fact that he had to leave because he couldn't, he had to leave Scotland. His dad had, moved around, England, working for the civil service, but it's just a story we all have in our families. And, for me, it was, the other end of it. And, my dad couldn't really, he was an Episcopal minister in Edinburgh in the mid 60s, and he had a falling out and he had to leave. And I remember he became a Unitarian minister. And I think he was applying for a job in Scotland, and I think he even got one as he's a Unitarian minister here, but the pay was like a quarter, something like that. There's just no way, so we stuck in the States, but I got over here as quick as I could. But anyway, so but I did have a few elements that you can, that I thought that, would be helpful to include in a Scottish constitution, because because you have what are called negative rights and positive rights. Negative rights are kind of what we call procedural rights, where, for example, freedom of speech. Negative, not in the sense of good or bad, but a negative right is something that prevents the state from infringing on a certain liberty, like, freedom of religion, that's a perfect example. Freedom of speech, all that, that's a negative right. And America has some of them sort of still, but they're being eroded. Abortion's a perfect example. The right to privacy is not in the Constitution. It was kind of developed as a penumbra in the 1965 Griswold case, which gave the right to a contraception, back in the 60s. But there's no right to privacy, so they had, okay, we'll take a little bit of this Fourth Amendment, a little bit of the Third Amendment, put it together, and create the right to privacy. But it was always very fragile, and it just got smashed to bits with the recent abortion decision. So, these are some of the key elements that I see as absolutely indispensable in an independent Scotland. And so, first of all, it needs to be written in broad daylight. It cannot be written in some, boarded up, shuttered, with mechanisms for popular participation. A few years ago, I developed a Wikipedia-based constitution, ScottishConstitution.com. The site kind of crumbled. I still got all the information, so don't worry. And we're trying to set up something more effective on the SSRG website, so that will be available. There needs to be very, very strong environmental protection, and the absolute sovereignty of Scots over their. You can't, any Scottish government should never say, "Oh yeah, let's sell that let's sell that port to a private equity fund." That's absurd. Fracking should never ever be even remotely considered, but there has to be strong laws in place and applicable laws so that it can never happen without popular consent. And I don't know how fracking could ever get popular consent. So that's just one example. There needs to be a people's upper chamber. And I think that's what we're going to try to develop. And our colleague David Younger has done some pretty good work on this. And we're talking about I'll wrap up. I'll finish up. And having a people's upper chamber, very strong anti-corruption laws in the Constitution, not in the laws, but in the Constitution. So that it cannot, these laws cannot just be overturned willy-nilly. And also and above all, and I can explain more in the Q&A, but a mass simplification of the legal system. If you look at, I got a spreadsheet of all of the Westminster laws, most of the pre 1707 Scots laws, all of the Westminster laws, and the Holyrood laws since over these. I don't know if it's complete, but anyway. And so you have law after law after law after law. The Expel the Jocks Act from 1432. It's still on the books, or stuff like that. And it's still potentially applicable. Why not merge all of these laws into different spheres of law and domains of law, and then completely rewrite the legal system where it's simple, understandable, no Latin, none of this BS stuff that you can't understand, written in simple, clear language so that everybody can obey it, and it cannot be used against you given these ridiculous wording type things. So unfortunately, I'll have to leave it at that. But please have on the SSRG's website, please have a look at the Constitution that I've written. Let me finish. Just one more second. Let me just finish up the. I just wanted to read the preamble that I've done, and then we'll get to Q&A. So the preamble that I've written: we, the people of the sovereign, free and democratic state of Scotland, for the love of our fair nation and the proud countrymen and women, do hereby express and enact our collective will through this Scottish Constitution, the supreme and fundamental law of Scotland, which holds that the founding principles of the Scottish state are popular sovereignty as the sole basis for legitimacy, human rights for all, including equality, freedom, justice, a sustainable environment, and the search for happiness. This Constitution hereby provides, in these detailed articles, a basis for the continual application and respect of these constitutional rights across all of Scottish governance and society, comprehensively underpinned by the most modern technology throughout all governing structures. All domains in the law of law, treaties, regulations, and other laws, whether enacted past, present, or future, will be void and without effect to the extent that they are incompatible with this Constitution. So on that note.
Love it. Just put in popular sovereignty of the people and primacy of the common good, which is the only legitimate aim of. Well,
I got that after that, but
it was a right one.
Okay. Questions.
Before we come to this lady there, we've got two that have come in online. So there are people online watching. A couple of anonymous ones. I wonder who they could be. So Peter Young asks, should a Danish-style constitutional safeguard of national independence be included / added to the Scottish Constitution in order to avoid entry into another incorporating union that undermines that nation state?
Let's see. I would say that I guess they're referring to the European Union or this type of thing. Well, I think that any entry into another institution like the European Union would need to be ratified by it, and it does imply a certain sharing of sovereignty. When one engages in that, and as long as that's agreed to, whether it's economic and decision making. That's relevant, and myself, I'm much more of the view that EFTA is a much better option, at least in the short term. At least in the short term, maybe the EU can offer a better deal over time. I don't know, but EFTA is much easier to enter into. And I've been in contact with them, and one of the reasons that the EFTA countries like it is they're able to maintain their sovereignty. And so that's a big reason. So I don't know if either of you want to chime in on that.
Well, there is one thing, which is that you can't put contradictory principles into a constitution. Obviously, what I want is to have. Let me just tell you that access to justice you're talking about is already in the Claim of Right. So once you have the principles established, the two underpinning principles of the Scottish Constitution are there. They're clear: the sovereignty of the Scottish people and the common good. You can't add something to that undermines the sovereignty of the Scottish people. So you can't give a government the right, or deny a government the right to enter into, say, the EU. If the people of Scotland wanted that, there are things I would hate to see Scotland vote for, but I have to accept that if the people of Scotland are sovereign, they might vote for something I don't want. So I would say you can't, if we're going to honour the sovereignty of the Scottish people, you can't put a rider in that will tie the hands of a government from doing what the people might want to do. Mm-hmm. And the majority of Scotland, I hope that the majority of Scotland will see that EFTA is a really good option for us, and it's quick. But if they end up being persuaded that we need to rejoin the EU, we're going to have to suck it up because the people are suffering.
But I just wanted, I just wanted to quickly add to that there needs to be rock solid democratic mechanisms put in place.
We
No
don't have
more
those.
2014 style referendums.
We don't have that.
You know,
we have rigged voting systems, and we cannot have that.
Yeah, and no, it has to be absolutely transparent.
Yeah.
And Estonia is a good example where electronics are used that's much more verifiable. But again, if something is held to be the will of the Scots, it has to be empirically and technologically verifiable, and not just some
Absolutely.
whitewash, BS corrupt referendum that I'm very concerned about if there is a referendum, next year.
So before I go over to a question, one comment from Brian Elliott Miller online. He says, "Thank you, Sarah, so much for all you presented. Very little, if any, was ever taught to us in school. I wonder why."
Hi, I'm Lorraine Cowan, and I'm a trustee of a charity called Constitution for Scotland. As you know, Mark, there are a number of different constitutions.
Absolutely.
The one that we have, and the prime reason for it, is to ensure that it is the people of Scotland who write the Constitution. And as such, what we've done is we've put together the broad strokes of a constitution in plain language, and using a platform which is certified by the UN, which is called CONSOL, and CONSOL is used to carry out public consultations by governments and local councils across the world. We have put together a website called constitutionforscotland.scot, and you can go on there and register, and you can vote for or against. You can propose amendments and adaptations to the entire constitution that is sitting there. I personally added an amendment saying that I wanted a second chamber that would be a citizens' assembly in the government. The entire purpose of what we're putting together is not to produce the constitution. It is to put forward at the date of a yes vote ideas and suggestions to a citizens' assembly, who will then bring this together and then go for a vote to the people of Scotland. So it's very much
In the spirit.
in the spirit of the original constitution that you're talking about, but it is for the people of Scotland to have their say.
Well,
Just
sorry, can I just quickly?
please.
What I would like to do is to suggest that we look at where the next kind of stage of what we're hoping to do is to take the principles that we have in this, that belong to us, that they say, the thing about our constitution that develops that is uncodified or unwritten, and we're lucky that so much of it was written in the Claim of Right, is that it tells your story. It's not just all the things it does, which are so important. It also tells, it's your journey. And we need that. So I would like to see that as a core, and then have people say, well, that could lead to that, and that's this. And we already have a right to privacy in the Claim of Right, believe it or not. We already have a right to the kind of, to access, not just to justice, but to access to justice. What does that do to the way they've taken away legal aid? If you can't afford a solicitor to get basic justice, how do we have that access? It's got really modern provisions. So to have that explained very simply, and then say, okay, Scotland, here is the constitution you've got. Would you like to keep it and build in it? And it puts you in charge. But you want to start again and throw out all our journey to that point. So that's all I would add. There's nothing to stop us building, and everybody have their input and say, I'd like to add this, or I'd like to put this in, or make sure that doesn't mean that, but this doesn't look at the environment. We need to be much more specific about the environment, that kind of thing. So that's where I see us going from. This is who we are. Let's put this out there. This is who we are. Here's how we got here. every single one of those provisions has got really interesting history behind it. It came out of something really powerful that was happening to the people of Scotland. Let's put it back. What I'm saying is, I think this needs to be like, you know how we regard the Declaration of Arbroath and the Declaration of the Clergy? The constitutional provisions of the claim of right are untouchable, like those.
And I just want go ahead. And I just wanted to mention, if anybody of you had quick questions on infrastructure as well for Ian that we were not able to ask before. But anyway, please go ahead.
Well, it's much of a clarification myself, but that's my understanding as well, that basically the fundamentals or the foundations of our nation are the claim of right, and that we add to them, such as I suggested, with a clause in setting out our ideas for transportation, or setting out people's rights, but nothing can be added that's in any way incongruous with our claim of right. The claim of right is sacrosanct, and so anything that we add to our constitution cannot invalidate that.
Can I just underline that? The way they hid the Constitution was to make out that it was a purely religious provision, had to do with the papists and whatever. It absolutely wasn't. In 1699, William of Orange they were getting ready, the Scots were getting ready to put him on trial. He was going to be called to appear in a court, a king. Now look, we'd done that to kings in the past, but we're Scotland and they just didn't get that, right? And so this was getting near and near. I couldn't believe it. They're going to put him on trial. It's the king, we're going to put him on trial. And it couldn't happen. And so as a result, he finally, because he had killed, let me tell you, to get the Dutch East India Company going, he had to kill their biggest rival off. You want to know who their biggest rival was? Scotland's trading merchants, Scotland's trading fleet. He killed Scotland's trading fleet, shipping act, trading act with England, alien act, blah, blah. Killed it. And that led to famine, by the way, and that's a whole other story. But when it came to them, he was going to face trial, he said, right, I'll give you a colony. I'll give you a trading colony. I'll let you can have your colony in Darien, Panama. So you trade all the way across the world. And here's a letter, and you can read it. I promise my faithful subjects, I will lovingly look after their interests. I will take them keep them as close to my heart as my own family, blah, 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 right? Then he killed Darien. Every person in Scotland that could invested in the Darien scheme. So Scotland wasn't bankrupted when Darien went down, but the people were.
Yeah.
And so they started a petition. And and a petition was different in those days. It had, it wasn't like we do and they say, off you go. The petition had power, had force. That's why it's in the claim of right, the right to petition. It's heard by courts, and you put in that petition in Scotland because of salvo. You put in a petition, and that will go, and the court can rule on it, and they could tell them, you can't do that, right? Or you have to do this. It was amazingly more democratic than we've got today. So he was really worried about this, and he'd done this. I mean, he was a bastard. He'd killed umpteen people in Holland, then he came over and he got the Glencoe massacre going, then he promised them Darien, then he killed off Darien, he banked up all these people. Then they raised this petition, so he decides he's going to pass a law that he can only raise a petition in Scotland with his consent, right? Now he signed the claim, he's going to uphold the claim of right, absolutely observe it, and real, oh dear. They want to present a petition on Darien? I don't think so. Let's put a law through to say they can't do it in Scotland. And so the Privy Council refused to put it forward. And the Parliament refused to hear it, and they reminded him that he had sworn an oath under the claim of right. What's that got to do with papists? Not a lot. So he then said, right, we're going to change this. We will do. They had riots in Scotland about it, and they raised a petition of 20,000 signatures. That was pretty big in those days, despite him saying, this is going to be law anyway. We're going to do this anyway. So he failed, claim of right was upheld, and the Parliament, this is where I'm getting to, his faction in the Scottish Parliament started arguing Well, see, the Convention of the Estates isn't a parliament. It was a convention, it was a constitutional provision. It's not real parliament. It doesn't have any, it shouldn't have any real powers. It doesn't have any real powers, so it doesn't really count. Claim of right doesn't really count. So the Scottish Parliament replied, yes, it does. And they were, by the way, they'd been reconstituted as the Parliament. They'd been the Convention of the Estates. So they said, oh, aye, it does. Of course it has these powers. It's just got the same powers as the Parliament. It's just not the Parliament. So then the court faction said, well, then it's a Parliament. We can amend the claim of right. So this, I mean, there were ructions about this, up and down, blah. So the Parliament began drafting new legislation. In 1702, William was killed accidentally by a fall from his horse. I kind of wonder if it was an accident, but anyway, he was killed falling from his horse. So the legislation that was in place had to be delayed until Queen Anne had been sworn in. She had to come and take the coronation oath in Scotland. As soon as she was in, they passed the legislation. It is high treason in Scotland to criticise, amend, subvert, or attempt to alter the claim of right, or to suggest that the Convention of the Estates was not sufficient authority to pass constitutional legislation and conferring the status of a parliament on the Convention of the Estates. And since the Convention of the Estates is a constitutional provision and not a sitting body, guess what? If we reconvene it, it has the status of a parliament with the job of a tribunal. So let's not get rid of it. Sorry? You can't dissolve a constitutional provision.
Right.
I think the only job we've got is getting this across to people. That's what we've got to do.
One more question here. Yeah.
So we've just had a comment from Ian McKenzie online. To move forward as a nation, we need to understand the past.
We have a slogan now in Salvo. Know your past to shape your future.
Sovereignty, my question, sovereignty, as in popular sovereignty, and how I feel like I own a pot of gold, and as a country we own a pot of gold, but no one is given validating this pot of gold. They've endorsed it, but they're ignoring it. And how do we execute it? And how do we make sure that they're executed?
So it's all about execution.
Look, sovereignty, do you remember, were you here when I read out the definition of sovereignty? No, Westminster Court's definition of the High Court's definition of Westminster sovereignty and what that is. Right. Well, I'll give it to you later. What sovereignty really means is that the power, the authority, the final court in Scotland is the people collectively. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a mechanism for that collective authority, right? Mm-hmm. There are two mechanisms, well, actually there's three, right? So, first is the Constitution. The Constitution sets out both negative and positive, and that's in the claim of right. The compact between the people and the government. So, we will lend you your power on condition that you uphold this contract. This contract says what you may do and what you may not. We will have an ombudsman, a tribunal, a chamber that ensures that this contract is kept. It has the right of veto, impeachment, removal, and redress. So you have a set of rules that the people have agreed. These are. Aye. Yes, but how are we using them? We can't until we reinstate our constitution with the provisions of the convention. So endorsed by the Scottish government, right? No, the Scottish government hasn't got a bloody clue what they've endorsed. Endorsed by the
House of Commons,
Sorry.
right, that we have
Yes.
sovereignty, that we are popular sovereignty, right? Scotland is a popular
Yes.
sovereignty state, right? But we have popular sovereignty that we're not utilising.
We have popular sovereignty in name only because they've ensured we have no mechanism of enforcement.
That's the point I'm trying to.
So the point
How do
about
we re-establish
Salvo,
that mechanism?
so the point is that we are going to get this constitution back with the provision. You can't have a right you're not allowed to enforce.
But we already have that right, we don't need to wait till we re-establish the provision.
You can't, love, you can't do it without a mechanism.
Exactly, but it doesn't mean that we don't have it, we do have it, but yes, we do, we're in agreement that we need a mechanism, so who and when and why are we getting this, not
Join
why,
Salvo.
but when are we getting this mechanism, and what, that is our priority,
We'll be talking
and
more about
our
that
main
this afternoon.
priority.
That will be one of the things that's covered from 2 o'clock onwards.
We're looking to put every provision of the Scottish Constitution back in place with international recognition. Okay, that's what this is all about, what Salvo is all about.
Any more questions before we break for lunch? Right, one there and one there.
Hello, I've got a question for Mr. Cameron regarding the potatoes that travelled 1,000 miles or 500 miles down south and then 500 miles back up the road. The tatties that travelled. So how much of that journey was to do with food security for Mother England?
Oh, that is a very good question, and I think that's part of it. But it's also part of the lobby, this very strong lobby that the haulage companies have, you know, which they and the supermarkets, because the supermarkets, as I said there, they want to operate in that way. They want a centralised distribution system because that brings them more profit, increases their profit greatly. And you know, you just need to look at Lord Sainsbury, look at Tesco's and their connections to the Tory party, and you realise why this thing operates, and people are just are asleep to what's going on. And I mean, when you put it up blatantly that, people should be up in arms about that.
Yeah.
I mean, people should.
That's a quick question. I was in Lithuania a few years ago, and what I noticed was there was some old trolley buses, and then turned the corner, brand new trolley buses built by Siemens or whatever it is in Germany. And I thought to myself, Scotland's abundance of electricity. Why can't we have a transport system that runs not on rails where you have to dig 6 feet down like a tram, but trolley buses where you don't dig up the road and all you've got is the wires overhead? Would that be?
Well, but all possibilities have got to be looked at. But the main thing is we get as much off the roads as we can.
Yes.
We use the rail system, and that means combining with other ideas. You know, we have got to work with our potential to land reform. We've got to be like they did in Holland and things, that they've doubled up tracks, so it means that you're never caught behind a broken down train. You can put your goods trains right through, and that means very often being able to say, wait a minute, we will reclaim some of this land for the common good, you know, and we will so we can expand our track width, etc. We need to look at the way we can use our waterways, our inland and round the coast waterways with shipping. We've got to just a combination, and this is why I want a working group, that we engage as many people across the spectrum in Scotland to decide on how we want to. And I've had people come to me and say, oh well, we've got greater priorities than that. Well, no, that's part of it. We've got to look at what kind of Scotland we want, and it may be a long-term plan, but we've got to look at how we work towards that. How we're going to put in place a modern, efficient transport system which the people of Scotland can be proud of, and which will be on a par or better than any other nation in Europe.
And it's environmentally much safer.
Absolutely.
Hi, this question will probably be answered this afternoon, but I have an American friend, And I was telling her about the claim of right, and she was mesmerised. She knew nothing about it. She thought, obviously, she thought it was amazing. But that's a huge message to get out to everyone in Scotland. Now, for those who campaign on stalls, what we could do with is a very, very, very simplified handout. Because to actually get this message over at a stall, just speaking is almost impossible. So that would be wonderful.
Okay, so we shall break for lunch and reconvene at 2 o'clock.